Well, Jim, we certainly don't want to sleep on any more of these questions, so let's get the next one here on the show. This one was sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Kyle in Columbus, Ohio. I was watching the 1992 Royal Rumble and thinking about how Vince McMahon loves guys that can turn heads at an airport. What about the Warlord? He never really became a star. Why? Seems to me like he was the kind of guy that Vince loved.
Oh, well, he was the kind of guy that everybody loved, actually, because he's such a nice guy. His name's Terry Sapinski. And he showed up out of nowhere for me in 1986 for Crockett. I'm trying to remember. He was a Minneapolis guy. Imagine that. A big bodybuilder from Minneapolis or from the Midwest originally. I think maybe he got in or got trained with, some of those other guys, but when he was in the NWA for Crockett in 1986, he was 21 years old and weighed 310 pounds, and almost none of it was fat. I mean, he was hard as a rock. When he would grab you to do something and you would touch him, just every place you touched felt like this counter that I'm leaning on, right? And they put him with baby dolls. So a couple of times, Big Bubba Rogers and the Warlord had a confrontation. And I mean, I'm sure Terry will admit at this point, he was greener than a pepper tree. But he was so strong. One time I rolled out of the ring to avoid baby doll doing something, and I stand up and, oh, there's the Warlord. And he just reached out with his hands under my arms. And I was 210 pounds probably at that point. And just picked me up and set me back up on the apron of the ring, just like a little small child. By 92, he was old. He was in his late 20s. He had been around the business a little bit more. He understood more how to work and got the picture of being a big, giant, like his team with Barbarian or, whatever. But he wasn't, he was never a smooth or necessarily exciting, speedster performer in the ring. He was a big power guy. And Vince loved guys like that, as a lot of promoters did. But I don't know that I ever saw the Warlord as being a potential for singles stardom, because by his size, he was somewhat limited in just how he could move and what he could do, but he learned to make it work for him. And I saw him actually on one of those big time wrestling shows. I think it was in Raleigh and Spartanburg. When he and Barbarian were working as a team. This was 4 or 5 years ago. And they were older, but they could probably do more of their shit that they did from 25 years beforehand than, guys like the Rock and Roll Express could, because they weren't doing Hava Coronas and missile drop kicks to begin with. But that was, a very nice guy. And once he got the hang of things, easy to work with despite his freakish strength, but not necessarily a singles champion run in his future or past as it is now.
You can't think of any classic Warlord matches. Wasn't really a promo, always had a manager. Physically, he may have been the biggest guy ever because of how shredded he was or how big and jacked he was for that size.
Oh, and here's another thing. He was 21 years old. He was 310 pounds and not a lick of body fat. But the story he was telling was he graduated high school 3 years beforehand at 185 pounds. So that was a pretty substantial weight gain in a short period of time. And it, probably a record for something like that. But
and if you notice, he kind of went away when the steroid problem started happening to the WWF.
Yeah, he might have been somewhat of what do they call him? A red flag that maybe he's
Neon
on a few
sign.
Supplements. Neon sign, but I liked him. I never had a single problem with him at all. He's a very nice guy. But if you were trying to tell the federal government that none of your talent was on steroids, he probably wasn't the person to put in the front of the line.
And of course, if you ever wanted to use an example of, for the people who argue that Dusty Rhodes was shot in 1988, I think one of the things you could point to is Road Warriors Powers of Pain scaffold matches. Which,
That's
of course,
that's
was
why
why they
quit.
jumped. I know. Of course they did. Wouldn't you? If you were that size, I obviously.
Well, yeah, I said, wouldn't you? I didn't. No, but no, that's the thing is, because we all looked at that when we first saw it and said, what the fuck? And they went through with talking about it, but they weren't going to go through with doing it. And what was that old commercial? Does the time for talking about it is over with. It's time to do it, baby. Get it done, whatever. Well, they didn't want to get it done because it's one thing. We had got the scaffold match over where it was, because that was before they had just done it to death. It was basically the Midnight and Road Warriors and then the Midnight and Rock and Roll or Midnight and Fantastics. That's the only scaffold matches they've had, or they had at that point. And, you know, Dusty saw, well, the people are going to think what's going to happen when these two giant teams face off on a scaffold. Well, the two giant teams were wondering also, and the Road Warriors knew they weren't taking the bump. So that left the Barbarian and Warlord, and at 300 pounds apiece, neither one of them felt like dropping 20 feet, whether in a controlled manner or not, to the ground. So they instead decided to go to the WWF. So that was kind of a self-fulfilling, hey, want to get rid of Warlord and Barbarian, Dusty? No, baby, I'm going to book them in a scaffold. Well, you just got rid of them anyway.
So where was the line on the card of who had contracts and who didn't with Crockett?
Oh God.
Because if they were able to just jump there, that means they didn't have a contract.
Yeah, see, Crockett gave out the first contracts that Crockett gave out, as I recall, and this is off the top of my head. I have copies in my drawer, but I can't reach it, and I'm not going to hold the program up just for this, but they were late 1985. And those contracts basically were booking contracts that they guaranteed they would pay you commensurate with what, you know, the normal prevailing practice was in the professional wrestling community. I believe that was the verbiage, which meant anything they wanted, but you were tied to them to be your booker because they had the national TV, the TBS, and they wanted to make sure they had their key talent tied up. And then, you know, we're like, okay, nobody's ever asked us to sign a contract, but it's not like we don't want to be here. We want to be on national TV. So we're going to sign this. And I think that was for a year or two. But then we started hearing that since the contracts don't guarantee any money, chances are they probably wouldn't hold up in court. And it may have been just for a year at that point because they were dipping their toe in the water. And that's when we had, I can speak for me and the Midnight Express, when we early in spring of 86, when we had that little jaunt up to Connecticut to meet with Vince McMahon the first time and tried to keep it a secret. But Tully's friend that worked at US Air saw us getting on the plane to New York on our off day. So there you go. So immediately upon us getting back, like within the next week, Crockett had presented us with other contracts that guaranteed us money. And that was a 3-year deal, and it guaranteed us $100,000 for the first year, $125,000 for the second year, $150,000 for the third year. And we were already at that point in 1986. My God, we'd already started the run with the Rock and Roll Express. We'd had a couple of $4,000 and $5,000 weeks that March, so we had already made better than half the $100,000. You know, way before middle of the year. So anyway, but that was a guarantee. You won't make less than this. You can make more. See, that's the thing. Those were the minimum guarantees. So anyway, as we've talked about before, we decided not to go to New York and upset the apple cart and leave the Rock and Roll Express and probably have to move from Charlotte and et cetera. The whole thing was the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette were better off in the NWA than the WWF. But that was the second round of contracts. And the question you asked was who was on them. I'm going to say in 1986, it was the Horsemen, Flair, Tully, Arn, maybe or maybe not Ole, because I think Ole was just always, at that point in his life, he was always just doing a favor by being there to begin with. He wasn't going to sign anything that he couldn't leave and go home anytime he wanted to. Luger was the first big guaranteed contract. the big one. He got $350,000, which led to no end of consternation from everybody else that this green guy from Florida that's coming up to do on-the-job training got through. That's where Lex got his first heat with the boys. Definitely Dusty, definitely Magnum, definitely the Rock and Roll Express, the Midnight Express, and myself. I'm trying to think, in 1986, the first round of contracts, I don't know if anybody else would have necessarily been included.
So like Jimmy Valiant, contract or no contract, if you have to guess?
Interesting. I don't know. Of course, Jimmy was gone by 88 anyway. So by the time that the question you were asking was pertaining to Warlord and Barbarian, I don't think they put them on contract, even though that they were using them on top. If they did, maybe it had expired at that point or whatever. But not everybody that worked on the shows was on contract, just the guys that they thought they needed to build the company around. So in some cases, and that's Rude and Manny. Manny had always been around because he was one of Dusty's pets and favorite guys. And Rude was at that time, they'd brought him up from Florida, and that was his first real main event level push in a big territory. So they may not have thought it was worth it. And they put the World Tag Team titles on him. And then they're both gone. And I guess they didn't realize that, Rude would go to the WWF, whereas Manny was just gone. Where did he go? Did he just go home?
I remember him working some AWA shots, but I think that was after this. I think he just went home.
That may have been it.
That is weird. I mean, everyone else went somewhere. Manny Fernandez just left.
Went home. I thought he was a tremendous talent as a worker, but gee, remember the time he did a shoot interview here several years ago, and he told everybody that the Mexican death match between he and Abdullah the Butcher was supposed to be the main event at Starrcade 85, but when Dusty saw the house, he put him and Flair on last. Good God. That's why the programs that were printed a month in advance had the Mexican death match on fourth.